I won't take any time. I'll just point out that we have here Richard Sloan from Columbia, Julian Thayer from UC Irvine. You never really know where Julian's going to be, but right now you can find him at UC Irvine. And our own Lauren Whitehurst, an early stage investigator and a newish faculty member at University of Kentucky, which is where I'm located. So we're very happy to have her. Last night you heard a debate where everybody agreed. This is going to be a little bit different. I had to determine the order of go by random draw. They couldn't even agree on that. So buckle in, because this is going to be a good one. I've told them that they get 10 minutes with slides, very strict. I'll give you a 1-minute warning. And then we're going to have 4 minutes of response from each one in the same order. So we're going to be a little less loose because we have a little more to deal with here this afternoon. So without further ado, the person who drew the first slot is Julian Thayer. Oh, do you want to use mine? I don't have. That's here. Oh, it's coming. Okay.
So, do you have the? Can you hear me now? Okay, so
starting timer.
I don't know if they gave us sort of pros or cons on this, but can you see the slides now? Okay, so this is from a review. It says the vagus nervous system is a complicated neural network that maintains our body in psychophysiological balance. The end. Just to give you some idea, so this is the schematic of the vagus nerve. It innervates many organs of the body. There are 4 nuclei associated with the vagus nerve, 2 efferent, the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, and the nucleus ambiguus. There are 2 afferent nuclei, the nucleus of the stria terminalis and the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. And you can see that these this forms a system. So the way that we measure the vagus or vagus nerve activity in particular is with heart rate variability. I'm just going to show you some data trying to address the 2 questions. Does the vagus potentially mediate health and disease? And can we change the baseline? So the first slides are some data in support of this. First question. So a paper we published in 2015 showing that heart rate variability is more strongly associated with self-rated health than a whole range of other biomarkers. The second study published in 2019, we tried to identify a clinical cut point. And what we came up with was daytime RMSSD values, root mean square successive difference. For those of you that are not familiar, this is a measure of high frequency heart rate variability. Values below 25 milliseconds plus or minus 4 milliseconds indicated elevated risk with odds ratios ranging from 1.5 to 3.5 across a range of risk factors, including blood pressure, inflammation, cholesterol, glucose. This figure shows the blood pressure relationship. And what you can see is that for some of these indicators, the relationship is pretty linear, but for some, there's a sort of a clear cut point. So I've often been asked, is there a cut point below which people are at increased risk? This cut point seems to be 1. We are working on a paper where we show that this also holds for depression. So below this approximately 25 plus or minus 4 milliseconds, those with are at greater risk for depression. This is mortality data. The first is a paper we published this year looking at a measure of vagal neuroimmunomodulation. So this is RMSSD over IL-6 or CRP. I think the top trace shows the CRP relationship. So those in the lowest quartile of heart rate variability, of this measure, which is this ratio, have increased mortality compared to those in the highest quartile. And this is in a combined data set of Midas and Whitehall. If we just pull out the heart rate variability, the RMSSD, and from Whitehall, so on the, I guess it's your left-hand side, is the quartile association showing about a 30% greater risk of mortality. If we use the cut point, close to the cut point that we identified in the previous paper in the same data set, again, you see the difference between those with relatively low versus relatively high heart rate variability on mortality. So this just shows that heart rate variability, to answer the first question, may be a mediator of health and aging. And this is a figure from Kevin Tracy showing ways in which one could manipulate heart rate variability. So the question is, can we change the baseline? This is a paper in New England Journal of Medicine from my former colleague, Mark Madsen at the NIA, looking at intermittent fasting. So the effects on health and disease, one of the long-term adaptations is increased heart rate variability. This is two studies, one from my friend Richard Sloan, which is, I think, one of the best exercise studies showing that aerobic training can increase and detraining decrease heart rate variability. On the right-hand side is a study we did. Richard's study was 12 weeks of aerobic training or strength training, and then 4 weeks of deconditioning. And the study on the right, we gave inmates in a prison in Wisconsin salmon 3 times a week for 23 weeks. And you can see that the fish group increased their heart rate variability. This is data from Sylvain Laborde working on a meta-analysis showing the effects of slow breathing. And I want to emphasize the breathing studies, and I'll talk more about one of my own in some detail. And I pulled out the slide for the after intervention. So after multiple sessions of intervention, can the baseline change? And RMSSD goes up about 1/3 of a standard deviation. So with Mara Mather at USC, we've done a trial on, again, sort of a heart rate variability biofeedback-paced breathing paradigm for 5 weeks. And we show in older adults an effect on RMSSD, which is of the same order of magnitude, about 0.3 standard deviation difference. In the younger individuals in this particular study, it showed up at in the low frequency range, but that was the range in which they were trained to breathe. Interestingly, we also found that it changed cortical thickness. So this 5-week intervention of increasing heart rate variability, increased cortical thickness in the orbital frontal cortex, the lateral orbital frontal, and the medial orbital frontal cortex. These are areas in which we have historically found heart rate variability to be associated with them. This is a study also, the top figure, also with Mara, where we showed that the connectivity between the medial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the greater the connectivity, the greater the heart rate variability. This colored figure on the left is from a meta-analysis we published some years ago showing the brain regions that were involved. This was a meta-analysis of studies of heart rate variability and neuroimaging. And then just to show that we also find this in our 5-week trial, the connectivity in that medial prefrontal cortex amygdala connectivity changed with this 5-week training period. And I think that's it. So by way of summary, I tried to show that heart rate variability is related to health and aging, and that you can shift the baseline. So.
What's next?
I'll take the rest of the time. So let's statement of conflict of interest, unfortunately. I want to just take 1 minute to congratulate the various award recipients. Julian for his lifetime contribution to the field, Paige and Ken for their lifetime service awards, and Tika especially for her mentoring award. And I want you all to know that I myself am no slouch in the awards department. And I am as a candidate for the coveted ABMR Cynical Curmudgeon Award. And I intend to close the deal with this presentation. So. You'll forgive me, but some of you may have seen some of these slides before, but I thought it would be appropriate to have a historical perspective on this debate. And so I want to just run through a little bit of history. There was, of course, these are American debates. The famous Lincoln-Douglas debate of 1858, probably the high point in American rhetorical debates. The famous debate between John Watson, the founder of behaviorism, and William McDougall, who at the time was the preeminent social psychologist of the era, a very witty Scotsman who claimed, among other things, and he just cut Watson to pieces, claiming that the reason that Watson was so popular was because people were drawn to the preposterous, and also that Watson's omission of consciousness from his psychology was an unfortunate oversight. And then, of course, the first American presidential debate that was televised between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. People who were watching on television thought Kennedy won. People who were listening on radio thought that Nixon won because they couldn't see Nixon sweating so profusely. And then more recently, this debate. And so I have constructed what I modestly refer to as Sloan's law of rhetorical thermodynamics, which is that all rhetoric tends toward entropy, starting with the high point, the Lincoln-Douglas debate, and then Watson-McDougall, Kennedy-Nixon, Trump and a piece of shit, and who knows? Time will tell. So this is the vagus. This is what we're all talking about. The vagus is Julian has actually done me a favor in anticipating that the vagus innervates various organs throughout the body. It's the longest nerve in the body, and it innervates the heart, it innervates the gut, it innervates the larynx. And our primary measure of vagal activity is heart rate variability. And I think everybody knows pretty much how you measure it. And heart rate variability has been enormously predictive in cardiovascular disease, with studies showing that it predicts recurrent myocardial infarction in post-MI patients, the progression of heart disease in patients who already have heart disease, the development of heart disease in healthy controls, predicts stroke, it predicts metabolic syndrome. And actually, I'd never seen, I think Julian deserves some credit for, one of the problems with heart rate variability is that nobody has ever figured out what the cut point is, what constitutes elevated risk and what constitutes lower risk. And so I think that's a real contribution. However, there are, and the other thing I want to say is that both Steve Porges and Julian and Richard Lane have constructed very elaborate theories about the role of the vagus in a variety of dimensions, and they, you know, in our field, we're mostly empirical and not so theoretically driven, and these are really interesting and provocative and theories that I think are worth commending, but I have some problems with them, as you will soon see. And the problems relate to four categories: anatomy, unrepresentative samples, proliferation of the measure of heart rate variability to a variety of areas that I have some concerns about, and then the dependence, as Suzanne anticipated earlier today, on socioeconomic status. So anatomy. One of the central themes of polyvagal theory is that the vagus innervates the muscles of the face to convey emotions in a way that promotes social communication, facilitates social communication and emotional state. The problem is, and I'm not a neuroanatomist, so if some of you know more about this than I do, please correct me, but this is schematic of the neuroanatomy, and the larynx indeed is connected to the vagus. It's controlled by the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which is a branch of the vagus. There's the vagus in the lower right-hand corner. However, eye movement, which is central to conveying emotion, is not innervated by the vagus. It's innervated by cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, and the abducens nerve, not the vagus. And facial muscles are not controlled by the vagus either. They're controlled by the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7. And beyond the control of facial expression, emotions are conveyed by the body, and there's no vagal control of the body. And so the idea that the vagus is central to the conveying of emotion seems to me to be a stretch given this anatomy. But again, I'm not a neuroanatomist, so if somebody can correct me, I'm happy to learn that I'm wrong. Not really happy. But,
You'll get your turn.
Then the studies. Now, there are a ton of studies on heart rate variability. And I do not mean this to be a representative selection of studies, but I've read a lot of this literature. And much of it is based on narrow and unrepresentative samples. A great many of these studies are studies of undergraduate students who are between 18 and 22 years old. And the findings may be valid, but they certainly are not representative of the much larger sample that we're concerned with. So I looked at, I've been writing this review paper for, I don't even know how long, but so I've looked at 25 studies in which there are a total of 1,357 participants, and 87.5% of them are college students. In a relatively recent meta-analysis of heart rate variability and self-regulation, of 123 studies that were evaluated, 97 of them had participants under the age of 25. Another meta-analysis, another meta-analysis, 26 separate studies, 2,300 participants, mean age of the participants, 22.4 years old. And then another one in which age wasn't categorized as finely as the others, but 73% of the participants were under age 50. So I think there are reasons to be skeptical about the generalizability of the findings from these studies of such narrow and unrepresentative samples. Then there's the issue of proliferation. And by proliferation, I don't mean nuclear proliferation. I mean proliferation of studies that go, in my estimation, well beyond what is reasonably studied in relationship to heart rate variability. So there's delay of gratification associated with increased heart rate variability. More delay, greater heart rate variability. Increased executive function, increased heart rate variability. Increased emotion regulation, increased heart rate variability. Increased functional integrity, increased heart rate variability. Increased inhibitory control, increased heart rate variability. Increased justice, increased heart rate variability. Increased morality, heart rate variability. Increased gratitude, heart rate variability. Increased compassion, heart rate variability. You getting the picture here? But dysregulation, no. Decreased heart rate variability. So what are these, with the exception of this? Is that 10 minutes?
1 minute.
Not a chance. What do these, except for dysregulation, have in common? They are all positive attributes, and that raises a significant concern to me. So to borrow from Martin Luther King, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The arc of the vagus is long, and it bends toward justice, and apparently just about everything else that's good in the universe. So soon we'll be seeing these studies, and this is for you, Suzanne.
Thank you. Totally
And
agree.
financial success associated with more heart rate variability, and sophisticated taste associated with more heart rate variability, and musical ability associated with more heart rate variability. So where does it end? I'm going to come back to that in the 3 minutes that I'm going to take beyond my time limit.
You'll get 4 minutes when it's your turn.
Okay. Then there's the issue of socioeconomic status dependence, which I think is really important. Shall I come back to this?
You can come back to it.
Okay. So I don't mean to take.
I think am I mic'd?
You are
Am I
next.
good? Okay, great. So hi, everyone. So I'm Lauren Whitehurst at the University of Kentucky. And I think I'm on this panel with these extremely illustrious colleagues whose work I still swoon over to say sleep. And I am a sleep researcher and I study, once my slides are up, the parasympathetic nervous system during sleep. And so many of you might not be surprised that sleep matters. There's so many in this room doing so many great things and so much great work around sleep and its role. But the changes in high frequency heart rate variability, the changes in vaguely mediated heart rate variability also shift and change across sleep. And so what I'm showing you here is looking across different sleep stages: rest, non-REM stage 2 sleep, non-REM stage 3 sleep, and rapid eye movement sleep. And what we think, when I look at these data, what really brings to mind is that our body homeostasis, which is kind of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about autonomic arousal and shifts and changes, is also related to our sleep homeostasis. And so when we look at non-REM stage 3 sleep, we see this kind of drastic drop in autonomic arousal, with about half or so of that made up of high frequency heart rate variability or vaguely mediated heart rate variability. And then when we look at rapid eye movement sleep, it's like the weirdest thing ever, rapid eye movement sleep. I don't really know exactly what to make of it. We have this kind of desynchronized increased activity in the brain, and this also is mimicked in the body. So we see this kind of increase in autonomic outputs when we're not getting any external inputs, and some of that is also made up of this vaguely mediated heart rate variability. Now, this profile is actually pretty consistent. And if anyone has ever been a trainee and taking any sleep trainee workshops with Tika Hall, you would know that you can't talk about sleep without saying circadian rhythms. And so also trying to account for kind of how do these circadian changes control this relationship. In this study, we brought people in during a nap and these same people in at night. And we said, okay, this really is related to sleep and not so much the circadian system. And this also seems to matter. And so when we're looking at something that sleep really seems to be important for, it seems memory consolidation comes to the top of the list. And this autonomic activity during sleep seems to also predict memory consolidation. So in this study, we had people do a task that is sleep dependent. So we allowed them to take a nap with REM sleep, and we saw that their performance was improved compared to them staying awake. And when we tried to predict that performance, we found that with our sleep only variables, our kind of variables that we traditionally think about, minutes in during sleep, and even some kind of specific features like sleep spindles, how do they predict this performance? We do pretty well. We have an R-squared of 46 or so, we're doing pretty good. But then when we add in our heart rate variability predictors, we see that REM minutes still is in there, it's still predicting, but high frequency heart rate variability during REM also emerges as one of the most important predictors for memory consolidation. This is not apparent for HRV during wake. So going back to Richard's point, so we're not seeing this all the time in every condition. And it also was only apparent when we saw cognition that improved because of sleep. So we don't see it for cognitive activities that don't seem to have this sleep dependent effect. Now, we also wanted to say, well, what about any other type of cognition? So working memory, something that many of you might study as you're thinking about cognitive aging, right? How does working memory change with age? In this particular study, we saw that autonomic activity during sleep also predicted working memory performance. In this case, it was high frequency heart rate variability during slow wave sleep. which, unlike the previous task where REM seemed to be important, working memory seems to be more dependent on slow wave sleep and non-REM sleep features. And we find that that is where we see this prediction. We did not see REM sleep predicting this performance here. So we might have some stage dependent prediction, which in the traditional kind of cognitive sleep literature, that seems to also be true. So heart rate variability might be able to differentiate between these different cognitive domains as well. Now, we also think it's important not just the periphery and the brain, but we know that there's also coupling between these features during sleep. So we're looking at kind of brain-heart coupling. What do we see there? And so working with some really fantastic colleagues, particularly Mohsen Naji, who's an engineer and a fantastic signal processor, what he discovered was that when you're looking in non-REM sleep specifically, you see these heart rate accelerations. And what I'm showing you here is kind of this RR interval. And you see that right before that, in some of these cases, you have this increase in slow wave activity. And again, those of you in the audience who are really familiar with cognitive decline and change, we know that slow wave sleep seems to be really predictive of that. And this slow wave activity seems to occur right before autonomic arousal. And when it's coupled within this kind of 20-second time frame, and we're looking again at performance that does seem to benefit from periods of sleep, we find that these couplings also seem to predict performance. So we're in this particular study, we found that these kind of autonomic central events, is what we're calling them, predicts about 18% of the variance in performance. And those independent features, when we looked at kind of what was going on in the brain, our normal kind of electroencephalographic features, and we were looking at what was going on in the body, high frequency heart rate variability, they didn't predict as well. It really seemed that that coupling did a better job. So maybe this heart-brain coupling might predict this performance a little bit better. And when we think about aging, let's put that in the context for this conference, what's happening, what's going on? Well, we see that in, this is a cross-sectional study looking at older and younger adults, and we see that there's age-related losses in this cardiac activity across the lifespan. In this particular study, this is a NAP study, and what you see is that our older adults actually don't have enough REM sleep that we can even look at data in this particular study. Their sleep is declining, and so even during a daytime nap, they're getting less of that. When we look at this kind of autonomic central events, we also see differences across our age ranges, looking at younger and older adults. What are the implications of that for cognitive aging? Stay tuned, we're running studies. Even though we're still kind of thinking about this in cognitive aging, there has been some data just recently really thinking about, well, what's going on in this during the sleep profile, and how does that predict kind of cardiometabolic disease particularly? As was mentioned, there's a lot of studies looking at heart rate variability during wake, not as many looking at it during sleep. And in this study, they used some kind of machine learning to predict cardiovascular events, really broadly defined, from the sleep health heart study. And what they found, what I'm highlighting up there is, you have your normal predictors, age, BMI, metabolic factors, even apnea, hypopnea index, kind of sleep disturbance or sleep disordered breathing. But right up there, you also see high frequency heart rate variability during REM, high frequency heart rate variability during slow wave sleep. And this is better predicting in this particular sample than things like hypertension and lifetime cigarette smoking. And can we move it around? Can we change it? This was some really beautiful work done by Kim Powler and Phyllis Z's group, just really powerhouse sleep scientist groups, sleep medicine groups. And what they find is that this one particular technology with acoustic stimulation that you can present during sleep shifts and changes the amount of slow wave activity that you can have. And there's been a lot of studies showing that that can also change cognition. But what it also changes is heart rate variability. And so this seems to lag the slow wave activity effects, similar to that heart-brain coupling that we talked about. And this seems to happen during kind of later cycles, cycle 2 and cycle 3. It seems to be temporary. It starts to kind of disappear in the later cycles of sleep, but we have a way to kind of mediate it, and we can kind of leverage that going forward. So 2 questions. Is vagus activity a mediator of health and aging? How can we change the baseline? I'm running studies in my lab now, looking at that a little bit more, trying to stress out the body and look at kind of using the vagus to mediate that, also drive it to its baseline during sleep and see if we can mediate vagus activity. We're using things like vagus nerve stimulation to do things like that. So what I'll say right now is I don't know, but sleep is probably important.
Okay, Julian, I'm going to give you the option. You can do your response now, or you could have Richard finish his points and then respond. That's up to you. Okay.
Can you put my slides back on, please?
I just wanted to just sit and listen.
And you'll have 4 minutes.
Fortunately, I'm from New York and I can talk fast. You can't start the clock though until the slide.
I know.
Okay. So there's a tremendous dependence on socioeconomic status that much of this research. Remember, the impulse for most of these, the impetus for most of these studies was Michel's famous marshmallow study, which everybody knows. And as Suzanne pointed out yesterday, or was it earlier today, the data from that study came from children in the Stanford community in the 1950s, either children of faculty or children from the community, all well-to-do from a prosperous and predictable society. And as such, the findings are probably limited to that study, because if you take children from different socioeconomic levels and try the same test, you get different findings. Serge Appel in 2016 published a paper in Psych Science showing that the kids who came from the prosperous families were the ones who were able to delay gratification. But if you look at low SES kids from unpredictable environments, they do precisely the opposite. They take the treat right away. They do not delay gratification. And there are several other studies that manipulate dimensions of reliability and predictability. And just as you would expect in unpredictable situations, there's no delay of gratification. In the predictable situations where you can count on the treat to be there when the experimenter comes back, there's delay of gratification. And all of this is very nicely explained by life history theory, which is a branch of evolutionary ecology, which argues that individual development is shaped by the availability of resources. When environments are plentiful and predictable, it encourages behavioral strategies to wait and take gratification later. But when they're not, when they're resource depleted and unpredictable, it makes much more sense to take the treat now, because you don't know in 10 minutes if it's still going to be available. And so, contrary to the prevailing view, the preference for immediate over delayed gratification is a perfectly reasonable strategy, more adaptive than impulsive, and yet we use the term impulsivity as a pejorative, and it should not be regarded that way. So these recent studies plus life history theory conspire to make this point that the preference for immediate over delayed gratification is an entirely reasonable strategy, more adaptive than impulsive, and it's just as much an expression of self-regulation to take the treat now if you come from an impoverished background as it is to wait if you don't come from an impoverished background. That's already 4 minutes.
1 minute.
Huh? Okay, so this dimension of low self-regulatory capacity associated with immediate gratification as opposed to delayed gratification simply is wrong. And the vagus does what you would expect under these circumstances. And this is from Serge Apple. High SES kids wait, and the degree to which they wait is associated with increased heart rate variability. Low SES kids do precisely the opposite. For them, high vagal activity is associated with immediate as opposed to delayed gratification. And I can stop there, but the point is that there are significant cultural influences on science writ large and our science too. And if we fail to take into consideration those social and cultural influences, then at a bare minimum, our work lacks sufficient generalizability to be really meaningful. So that's.
Please.
So I will talk about a couple of, so Richard outlined 4 points, some of which we more or less agree upon. So I'll start from his latter point, the SES stuff. We've done a lot with that, and I agree that there's some complexity there. We've incorporated the life history stuff into our guts model, so we have a way of dealing with that. The proliferation, I also agree that a lot of people are using heart rate variability in lots of contexts in which it may not be appropriate, and that's why you need to talk to people who know about heart rate variability to make sense of what you're doing. So those are parts that Richard and I agree upon. So now I'll go back to the parts where we don't agree. So the anatomy. So how many of you are MDs in the audience? Do you know about the oculocardiac reflex? Okay, so the oculocardiac reflex is that the extraocular muscles, when you compress them by ocular compression, produces bradycardia. So there is an anatomy linking the eyes and these extraocular muscles to the vagus. This is the ophthalmic branch of the vagus nerve. So there is an anatomy linking these things. So I can send you the references. We did a series of studies back when I was at Penn State back in the 80s, linking ocular activity. And then there's also, of course, the dive reflex, cold water on the forehead. So all of this was used in clinical medicine to interrupt ventricular tachycardia. So there are those vagal influences. The second point that Richard mentioned was the non-representative samples. And I don't think any of the data I reported was on students. I used Midas and Whitehall, relatively representative samples for the things that I talked about. So I don't think that criticism holds for at least the data that I presented.
I'm not talking just about your side, I'm talking about the field.
The field, well, most psychology and most science, unfortunately, is done in college sophomores or freshmen. So there's a lot of that, and we've worked very hard to avoid that particular pitfall. So we have large samples. Some of the data I reported on were in tens of thousands of participants. So large representative samples.
Lauren, you have 4 minutes to respond to anything you like.
Just to talk, I think.
Yeah.
So, no one said anything too bad to me. I think that's the benefit of being ESI, right? Everyone's still so nice to you. So, I mean, I think that I would agree with the similar points that Julian just agreed with. It's not perfect. I think that there's a lot of places in which high frequency heart rate variability or vaguely mediated heart rate variability has been manipulated to be representative of all things good. And so what would I say to that is that a space that I think we can all look to might be sleep in that sense, right? So these same types of disparities, these same types of things that we're talking about I would expect them to play out in sleep, right? So the guts model that Julian referenced, really thinking about kind of how this kind of persistent vigilance around and looking out in the world instead of the allostatic model, where you're thinking about individuals being at baseline, coming in contact with the stressor and their physiology responding. Julian's really beautiful guts model suggests that you're, in a sense, always at a peripheral vigilance. You're kind of always navigating these things, and only when you detect that your body and your mind are safe can you then kind of relax and be into restoration. I think sleep is a perfect model to really think through that theory. You can imagine the amount of time, that sleep latency that it takes for people to rest, to get to sleep, would be a really good model to think about vigilance. And so that's, I think there's a lot of poor models out there. Sleep might be a better one.
All right, so we have 20 minutes for discussion. I'm gonna kick it off while you all come to the mic with your questions for the panel. So the conference theme is aging. And Rebecca Reed, who is here somewhere, there's Rebecca, did an analysis of the data from our older adults and found that executive function and self-regulation were weakly coupled, and heart rate variability was not correlated at all with either one. We all know that heart rate variability declines quite markedly with age. I'm wondering what you all make of that.
So with Mara Mather, we've been looking at the effects of age on these relationships. And what I can tell you is that while there are those declines with age, it may be that those populations are the most amenable to those interventions that we've done. So in the same study, what we have found is that on the flanker task, a measure of executive function, that intervention improved in the older sample, their performance on that task. And that association was larger than it was in the younger sample.
Richard, do you have thoughts? I mean, in essence, these are data that sort of support your curmudgeonly interpretation that heart rate variability being correlated with everything might as well be correlated with nothing.
Yeah, well, we published a paper from MIDAS data on executive function, and I'm sort of embarrassed to say that we tortured the data until it confessed. There was a very weak association between high frequency heart rate variability and executive function. I don't remember the details at this point, but it was nowhere near as strong as we expected it to be.
You controlled for SES maybe. No. I can't remember. There was something you controlled for and it got weaker. I know that study.
Yeah. You apparently know it better than I do.
Well, that's my job.
So Lauren, what do you think? What do your data say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I showed some data looking at kind of the reduction in high frequency heart rate variability with aging. And yeah, my plan is to kind of look at that and think through that and why it might be important for something like cognitive aging. But yeah, I kind of look at this from a standpoint of skepticism. Like, I'm okay with being skeptical of it. Like, I'm okay with saying that, like, it doesn't explain everything and we should think about why. I would want to know a lot more about that sample. Who are they? What is, like, you know, what does that look like? Who are these people? I do think that the amount of variability across the people in this sample might also matter. So I think all of those things are important to consider. But then I'm going to come back and say, like, maybe if you looked at it during sleep, you know, like maybe you're like, I think the ceiling that we have in heart rate variability when we're awake and our systems are already aroused and vigilant, it's very different than the variability you have pre-sleep and during rest and right before people are trying to engage sleep. So it might be a better understanding of what that homeostatic arousal shifts look like when we think about what's going on. And even a ratio of wake to sleep activity might even be a more interesting way to think about it.
Can I just add that we published a multi-center study on cortical thickness and heart rate variability and found this age effect indeed. So this is, and the idea being that cortical thickness in prefrontal cortex is positively correlated with heart rate variability, and with age, both decline. But what I showed you in the intervention study is that we could increase cortical thickness in those same areas, and then you see those increases in heart rate variability in those elderly people, and also the increase in their performance.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because, as we know, and we've heard, there's sort of this general decline in body integrity with age. Tell you from personal experience that that's true. And so just because two things are correlated in older age doesn't mean that they have any relationship to each other. They might just have this third variable, which is aging itself.
Yeah.
Let's have a question from the floor.
Hi, thanks for this. I'm Aaron Fisher. I'm from UC Berkeley, and I'm going to give Richard a run for his curmudgeon money here. And I will own that this is way more of a comment than a question. I apologize for being that guy. I want to challenge us, anyone on stage and anyone in the audience interested in these ideas, to get past our dependence on rank orders of level with these things. You know, the vagus nerve is a regulatory system, and it's regulating the functioning of all of our organs on a moment-to-moment basis, and it's part of a larger system of the enteric nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, the HPA axis, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these things are helping us to modulate our bodily responses to changing environmental demands. So this is a within-person dynamic temporal process, and yet we look at these things in between subjects, static data analyses almost exclusively. So, you know, for instance, sleep is a wonderful opportunity. You know, polysomnography, you're collecting all of this wonderful, dense, rich time series data. You can do intra-individual time series analysis. You know, and Steve Woodward and I have published a couple papers doing that. And just one quick example, we looked at average levels of RSA and found no difference between PTSD and controls. But when we looked at the dynamic control of RSA on heart rate in 30-second epochs over the full night's sleep, we saw this compensatory effect of all of the hypervigilance and sympathetic arousal being counteracted during sleep, where you saw increases in dynamic control. And it's just one example of all the ways, the wonderful rich ways that we could look at this. And I just want to encourage everyone to think more dynamically, more temporally, and more intra-individually about these things. So.
Totally agree. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a whole series of studies on circadian variation and also intra-individual variability. Again, we published a whole series of studies starting back in the late 80s on looking at intra-individual variability in these processes. So I agree completely. Can't out-curmudgeon me.
Hi, I just want to give a shout out to Richard. I'm going to be passive and supportive of you. Reminds me of our mesh days. But I study RSA in little kids, and the distribution of little kids that we study is almost what Richard was talking about. It's middle-class white kids, but I don't study that where I am. And so I have two pieces of information I would love you guys to think about. So the first is Ruth Feldman's model of biobehavioral synchrony, and that early social relationship is absolutely critical to establishing the regulatory capacities of the autonomic nervous system. And so when we think about buffering the effects of aging, social relatedness may be one of the ways to reestablish plasticity in the autonomic nervous system as we age. And I will challenge you to think about menopause as a wonderful opportunity. Okay, it's not, but it could be, right? Because estrogen's a demethylator, and potentially a sensitive period at which we have the opportunity to reset the autonomic nervous system. And the third piece of information I would love you guys to comment on is that now in 2 different studies, we have found that child RSA, above and beyond their own exposure to trauma, above and beyond SES, in a predominantly African-American population, was driven by mom's exposure to her own adverse childhood events before she became pregnant.
Thoughts?
A couple of thoughts. So I agree. We have done studies looking at early childhood adversity with, I don't know if Chris Fagundes is here. We have one paper that we submitted, another paper with a group in Italy, where we find that heart rate variability is moderating these associations. between early childhood adversity and later outcomes. So agree completely with you on that. I can't remember off the top of my head all of your other points, but so the menopause, we've been looking at pre and post-menopausal women with and without hormone replacement therapy. So we find heart rate variability changing as a function of that. Even with Richard, we published a paper recently looking at emotion as a function of phase of menstrual cycle with some students from student and Larry Jamner from UCI. So, and we have a whole meta-analysis on phase of menstrual cycle effects on heart rate variability. And so estrogen is an important modulator of the vagal influence on the heart at the central atrial node. I can't remember off the top of my head your other point, but I think I've covered a couple of them.
Yeah, I think, when you think about menopause, it's hormonal, but then there's also all these other changes. Sleep changes a lot
Right.
in perimenopause and menopause. And so, again, we're thinking about correlations, but what's the driver? And I think these intervention studies, improving sleep or improving heart rate variability, improving breathing, is kind of the way of the future,
Yeah.
it seems to me.
And I think also a part of that question was also related to the previous question of this idea that the system is dynamic and we should be thinking about these systems as related and connected and shifting and changing within moments and not so much these kind of static processes. And that's something that I do in my lab. So we have all types of sensors on people while they're sleeping, and we're looking at all types of things together and also pushing and pulling the system around with different interventions to see how that impacts this. So I agree with both kind of comments. And I think that some of the work is being done and some of the work still needs to be done. But yeah.
We hired her and you
Ah!
didn't.
I tried. I'm lost.
David Cresswell, Carnegie Mellon. I wanted to follow up maybe on a Richard point. I know Julian's thought about some of these issues, but this sort of link between heart rate variability and all of these sort of psychological benefits, I still sort of try to wrap my head around the biological plausibility of this measure of breaking of the heart and how that might sort of reflect executive function or some of these other outcomes. And I guess my question to you guys is around where we're at with heart rate variability and respiration. I tried to track this literature some time ago and still struggled to sort of make sense of respiration seems to be such a critical modulator for heart rate variability. And in a lot of these studies, I don't know if they control for respiration. And I'm just trying to understand how important respiration is as sort of a behavioral modulator of these effects.
Great question.
Okay, so I'll jump in. So a little bit of respiratory physiology. So from a respiratory physiologist perspective, there are three phases of respiration: inspiration, inspiratory pause, or what they call post-inspiration, and expiration. The vagal motor neurons in the brain fire maximally during that inspiratory pause, actually, and then decrease over time. So all heart rate variability measures are not created equal. Steve Porges did a lot on this. A paper with Greg Lewis from 2012 was pretty, from my mind, definitive. So if most of the people who are arguing for the control of respiration use the peak to trough method, which is completely obviously dependent upon respiration. Not all measures of heart rate variability are, but what Lewis showed in the 2012 paper is that if you did two things, even the peak to trough method became a very reliable measure of vagal function. And the one thing is that the data had to be normally distributed. The second thing is that you had to do a higher order detrending of this. So we have a paper coming out where we show that RMSSD actually works as a higher order detrender. If you log transform it, if it's not normally distributed, you have a measure that is relatively unaffected by respiration per se. What the Lewis paper showed is that if you take any of those measures, you can achieve that relatively respiration-free metric. So that's kind of the status of respiration. Now, in all the studies that I presented, we either used this RMSSD measure, which is relatively free of respiratory influences, or we did spectral analysis using higher order detrending and log transform data. So we satisfied the criteria for having a relatively respiration-free metric.
I don't agree. And well, I don't agree that there's respiration is not important. We've done a number of studies in which we either controlled for respiratory rate or not, and in most cases haven't seen a difference in the findings, but we have seen a difference in the heart rate variability metric. And Gary Bernson has published a series of papers in which it seems to me, to my reading, abundantly clear that RMSSD is no more independent of respiration than spectrally defined high frequency power.
Okay, so Gary, my former colleague at Ohio State, used a poor gold standard in those studies, and that will come out in the paper that we're publishing on. So he used as a gold standard high frequency heart rate variability using a lower order detrending, a linear detrending.
He's talking about MSSD.
That's what I'm saying, that he used as the gold standard to compare RMSSD against was a poor gold standard. So, yeah.
Tika. Oh, Julie.
I sat down for the respiration. So Julie Bauer, I'm from UCLA, and I'm speaking on behalf of my poor graduate student who went into her dissertation. She did a 4-study dissertation to examine everything related to heart rate variability. And it's kind of a follow-up on Suzanne's question, because the sample she was looking at was older adults with insomnia. She found no baseline correlations with anything, not inflammatory markers, not any psychosocial measures. And this is actually, the data was taken on a second night in the sleep lab right before they went to sleep. So it's interesting that she's getting them at that pre-sleep period. But I think more importantly, this was part of a trial that Mike Irwin conducted where he improved the sleep in these people, right? So they were all insomniacs. They gave them CBTI, they gave them Tai Chi, their sleep got better, their inflammatory biology got better. Heart rate variability was completely flat. It didn't work as there were no change over the course of the intervention. It mediated none of the effects, nor did it serve as a moderator of any of the effects. So this question of like, oh, these systems are interconnected, it really made us think a lot about what's happening in aging to these systems, and maybe these dynamic interplays between them are one of the things that gets broken. And there was so little in the literature on intervention studies, but also really on older adults. So just kind of wondering your thoughts about that.
Yeah. So flexibility conversation might be good.
So we just published a paper in Psychophysiology on stress and aging, and making basically a similar point that these systems sort of uncouple or potentially uncouple. And that's why this intervention study was so interesting in these older adults, that we can get them to sort of recouple in a salubrious way. So you're absolutely right. And Ari Goldberger and back in the old days, we're talking about sort of dynamical systems perspectives, and we're talking about sort of loss of input and loss of complexity. And that's what happens with aging, is that the multiple inputs become corrupted, you could say, or deteriorate. And the question is, can we reconnect?
Yeah, so the question that Julie is making is that you had an effective intervention, you improved sleep, you improved inflammatory biology. What do you make of the heart rate variability not changing in that trial?
Well, I would need to look at the data more carefully to say for sure, but I think we were having a discussion with Richie and Alyssa at lunch. Well, this is just statistics. I mean, some studies will show significant effects, some won't, even though in the population, the effect is there. I mean, that's just sampling. So
What?
It didn't, or it didn't.
What?
It didn't.
Just
Or it didn't.
statistics?
Yeah.
Where's the Berkeley guy?
He
Yeah.
left 15 minutes ago.
Yeah, I mean, or it didn't work, right? Or it's less flexible as people age and it's less amenable to intervention and it works well for some, you know, like
Well, this is why I'd like to see the data. I'd like to
Yeah.
see the effect size and the confidence interval on the effect size.
Well,
And then I
just a
can tell you
second.
more.
So I wish she'd talked to me before she did her analysis. So I can tell you that the majority of studies in sleep and heart rate variability and insomnia have not found an association between heart rate variability and insomnia. And then just please, anyone who thinks I'd like to incorporate sleep into my work, know that sleep is not one thing.
Correct.
So the fact of the matter is that insomnia is a problem of initiating and maintaining sleep. It has nothing to do with slow wave sleep. And Lauren showed us data and has been done across species that show that heart rate variability is tightly coupled with the depth of sleep, which has nothing to do with insomnia. And I'm not surprised that it's unrelated and it doesn't change. And even though I've published some of these papers myself, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. Right, well, I'm about to talk about another null funding.
You don't have to worry about it, but a dissertation student does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
For
you
those
know,
of you on Zoom, this is Tika Hall from University of Pittsburgh talking about these null findings in
Yeah.
the insomnia trial.
yeah, and the thing is to remind your student that a dissertation, whether they confirm their hypothesis or not, is a finished dissertation. So yay her. And we should be brave and have our students do creative science. So here's another conundrum. And you know where I'm going to go, Julian, with this. And this is work that we've published together. And that is that, and it gets to the issues, I have to put my little notes here. So with proliferation and representativeness. So we have, Julian and I together have published numerous papers looking at heart rate variability during sleep in the SWAN sample, study of women across the nation. So it's American Blacks and whites, midlife women. And the weird thing that we find is that heart rate variability is higher in Black women compared to white women. This has been shown during waking as well in other studies. And it gets to the question of, you know, that we always think of heart rate variability as a thing that's checked, that's a good thing, right? But then when we're trying to understand disparities and differences in sleep and opportunity, how do we get around these data that just butt up against the logical arguments that we've been making? Because it is a conundrum. And Julian, I know you're going to answer, but I think we also need to hear from Lauren and Richard, because I know what you're going to say and I really want to know the answer. So that's my question.
This question kind of goes back to an earlier point about compensating for arousal and trying to contain arousal, and heart rate variability being part of that containment system. If you have more to contain, maybe you have higher heart rate variability.
But the really weird thing during sleep is that, and again, we're talking about American Blacks compared to American whites. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
What we see is higher slow wave sleep as measured by spectral analysis or visually scored sleep in whites compared to Blacks. So higher slow wave sleep. And slow wave sleep is associated with higher heart rate variability. In Blacks, though, we see higher heart rate variability despite having lower slow wave sleep.
Yeah. No,
It's weird.
As you know, Tika, it's weird. I don't know really what to make of it, but I can give you some of my thoughts. And some of it is that kind of sleep body homeostasis thing that I alluded to. There's some new data out, and this actually is relevant to insomnia. Some new data out, again, from Phyllis Z's group, where they're looking at norepinephrine during the day. And they're showing that kind of higher rates of norepinephrine during the day are predicting this kind of deeper slow wave sleep during the night in healthy controls and not in insomniacs. And when I think about this, put this in the context of kind of racial minoritized folks, it's this, in a sense, in the insomniacs, they're seeing this decoupling of these two systems. And I think what you're saying is there's almost this decoupling of these two systems in in these Black women, in the sense that we're having this high heart rate variability, showing that there's some kind of peripheral activation, because that heart rate variability is dynamic, that's not tied to that sleep homeostasis. These two things seem to be in some sense decoupled. And that is also what we see with aging. That's also what we see with these other kinds of systems. So I think we need more variables than just the sleep and the heart rate variability. We need a little bit more about that autonomic nervous system and a little bit more about what's going on in the brain and how these things are related. But that's my first kind of thought, is that we're starting to see this decoupling earlier, maybe even sooner, in these groups of people.
Richard, you want
Well,
to have some?
we're already
Suzanne,
over by
I'm so
3
sorry.
minutes. We need to.
Sorry, we must hear from Eke. I'm sorry. He's worked for days on this AV system and he's finally, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you all for this wonderful content and presence. And I'm really sorry for all the mess I did. So I am not a scientist, but I'm using products that are coming from research, such as the biofeedback products from HeartMath. And I'm using this in for my personal family and myself, but also for my clients. I do have a private practice. And my question is, brain-heart coherence improved by improving through exercises and the HRV, does it show that there is actually a positive impact on depression? And does that coherence, if that coherence exists as an improved coherence through practice, does it carries over the night? And is it something that we can rely upon?
So in this trial with Mara Mather, we do show some effects on mood. We don't find a main effect on anxiety or depression, but again, that paper is under review. So we do find some effects of that type of breathing training intervention. So I think that there's some hope there for those processes. And again, it's because of this connection with the brain. So the effect that we find is actually mediated by the change in cortical thickness that the intervention provides, and not directly with the change in heart rate variability. But it's the heart rate variability that's changing the cortical thickness. So it's by kind of a secondary pathway.
If it continues over the night, we're still figuring that out. We don't have as much looking at mood and those things as it relates to heart rate variability changing across the night. But these are good questions, areas for future research.
And I'll just take 1 second to comment on Tika's question, which was the ethnic differences. So of course, we published this large study from Brazil with 15,000 people. We found that the darker the skin, the higher the heart rate variability. And we looked at that in response to discrimination, and we found that those darker skinned individuals also reported more exposure to discrimination. And when you statistically controlled for their exposure to discrimination, the ethnic difference in heart rate variability was reduced. So there are factors, and Lauren hit the nail on the head. It's this emotion regulation factor. So that was the other part of the cardiovascular conundrum that I didn't talk about the other night. That was the heart rate variability side. And there are reasons why we think that these people are engaging in more emotion regulation.
Let's thank our panel before it gets away from me again.
It's incredible. Thank you so much. And we're going to move right to our next one. If you need a bathroom break, please get up, stretch, take your break. But we are so behind, we're just going to flow into the next one. Liz Nielsen is waiting for us. So it is, yeah, this was so rich. Thank you. It was a great example of an open-minded, multi-perspective dialogue. Our next talk is going back to the title of the conference, Geroscience. And I just want to dedicate the conference to Liz Nielsen, who really inspired this, and also Paige Green, who have really represented behavioral and social science research at NIH in so many ways, but in this new field of geroscience. And we are just so pleased and honored to have Steve Krzyzewski join us. Steve is a PhD epidemiologist who has many specialties in aging and is also a gerontologist. And he is really at the center of, I'm going to say mainstream aging research. He's been involved in the main trials like Life and Health ABC, many of you know, and has really just contributed so much to how much we know about aging biology and population-based studies. He does so much service to the field. He is at the, kind of part of the infrastructure of both Alzheimer's research and AFAR, the American Federation of Aging Research Clinical Trials. And he also now runs a geroscience network, which he'll mention today. So welcome, Steve. And Liz Nielsen will speak after him. She is, as many of you know, the new division head of the Behavioral and Social Science Research branch at NIA. She's been at NIA for over 15 years and has been transformative. And many of the studies we've been hearing about are because of her advocacy and her seeing the connections and importance of areas and really prioritizing and moving this field forward. So it's become an exciting field to me, in part because of Liz's vision. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alyssa, for that very kind introduction. I'm very honored.